Hello, everybody. A book that I've been working on since 2011 is finally going to come out this year, and it's 50 pretty intensive interviews with different potters across the U.S., and a lot of what I'm going to say today is based on some of those interviews. Also, two of the artists who I'm going to be discussing today are here, although I can't spot them at the moment, but Mark, would you wave? Oh, there's Mark, okay. And Sanam? Okay, there's Sanam. So they also, might be people that you'd like to talk to. Okay. The exhibition currently on view at Concordia University in St. Paul is the story of a rural place and the sequence of potters who passed through. It begins, in a way, with Tim Crane. No, I have to look that way, not that way. Okay. It begins with Tim Crane, who, beginning in 1964, taught at Viterbo College in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and lived and worked in Brownsville, Minnesota. Mark Pharis met Crane through Warren McKenzie, who had once sent Pharis a poster for a Crane show and told him to go see some good straight pots. Crane had been one of Mackenzie's first assistants. Pharis, looking for a place to settle and make pots, after a couple of early teaching gigs, bought a 40-acre farm not far from Crane in 1973. I could make this sound exotic because the township is called Houston and the village is called Yucatan. But these distant-sounding names were only in southeastern Minnesota, 40 minutes from La Crosse, 1.5 hours from Rochester, and almost 3 hours from the Twin Cities driving along the Mississippi. It had been a family dairy farm, but was no longer being worked, and Pharis was able to buy the land, a small house with 3 tiny bedrooms and no central heat, a tiled milk barn, a garage, a chicken coop, and several other outbuildings for the affordable price of $26,000, with a modest down payment and a contract for deed. If Pharis had stayed on there forever, this wouldn't be anything remarkable and there would be no story. But after he began teaching permanently at the University of Minnesota, he eventually rented and then sold the place to his graduate student, Linda Sikora, and her new husband, Matt Metz. And they several times offered workspace to friends and to young potters not yet ready for graduate school. So it happens that over a period of 33 years, a dozen people worked or fired in this one distant, isolated place, some of them among the best-known potters today. Pharis had been teaching in Colorado and had thought about staying there, but he says, I really felt there was something going on in Minnesota that I wanted to be a part of. It was just beginning to emerge, and so it was a choice to come back here. The farm, he says, was a lot to look after. It's true, absolutely true, but it's gorgeous country. The physical beauty of the place was important. It was a good place for me for a while. This area of Minnesota was never covered by glaciers, so it has a more rolling terrain with ridges and valleys and streams and hardwood forests. Pharis notes that his exposure to agriculture and to the vernacular architecture of the region over those years influenced the forms and surfaces of his work. Only 10 or 12 of Pharis's 40 acres was tillable, and it had been mostly used for grazing cows. He was attracted to the barn, which accommodated 10 milk cows, not only for the space, about 20 by 40, but because the bottom several feet, as you see here, was both inside and out, covered with salt-glazed tiles in a mix of brown, red, tan, and yellow. After making it into a studio, he built his kiln. When he was a student at the University of Minnesota, he and others in his class had built a kiln at Mackenzie's property just for the experience, but Pharis's knowledge was modest. He had the idea of oil and wood combination, and he discovered that he particularly enjoyed the visual effects that resulted from the change in atmosphere. It only made a little wood ash. The new kiln was at first exposed And he soon hired a couple of guys from school to build a kiln shed. And he altered the kiln a little. He now says, with a laugh, "It was way too big for me." He had built it as big as Mackenzie's, but in his 16 years of working in Yucatan, he had a hard time producing enough work to fill it. One solution was not to fire very often. Another was to fire only one chamber. And another was to invite people to fire with him. And Crane was among the first. 5 or 6 years earlier, when the two were first getting acquainted, Pharis had spent a weekend with Crane, who then had a tiny kiln, which they described as having been buried in the ground and that it would only hold about 6 pots, which I think is exaggeration. But he was salt glazing, and Pharis at that time had very limited exposure to salt glazing because the university's kiln was indoors. Over Pharis's time in Yucatan, Crane also served as a sounding board as Pharis developed his work and began to experiment with patterns and geometry and slabs. Pharis also, for a time, shared not just the kiln, but the studio with Jan Knipe. He had met Knipe at the University of Minnesota, where she was a graduate student in painting and drawing in 69 or 70. But she included pots in her MFA show, which Pharis liked. Knipe and her husband moved to Seattle, but then probably in May of 1975, out of the blue, the couple suddenly came up Pharis's quarter-mile driveway. She was now teaching at Viterbo and living in a farmhouse near Brownsville, and Crane had told her that Pharis was there. She wanted to work more in clay, so 2 or 3 days a week she would come to work in the studio, and she fired with him. She was committed to functional work. They talked as they worked, and she had more experience with drawing and knew art history. He says, "Her expertise in painting actually turned into something for me, although not at the moment. She introduced me to Giorgio Morandi, and there's something about the line, the reductive use of space, and the sense of minimal gesture that could be transitioned into pots. It helped me think about pots and see them as drawing in some way, the actual pots and the sort of emerging geometry of the pots and the lines that were part of the formal business. I began to think about pots and drawing a lot more. I've always worked from sketches, but this was different." Knipe also introduced him to the work of Richard Diebenkorn and William Bailey. Bailey came to Viterbo as a visiting artist. Pharis saw in Bailey's paintings the intentional use of domestic space, seeing objects he was engaged with from a different perspective. Pharis and Knipe shared the studio for 4 or 5 years, and then she moved to Virginia, where she began to teach at Hollins College and became chair of the art department and gave up working in clay. But she had Pharis pots and John Reeve pots that she used in her still life paintings. Pharis was hired to fill in for Mackenzie, who had gone on leave, and he spent 3 years in a terrible 3-hour commute to Minneapolis. His work changed because while he was using stoneware at home, at the university he began to work in earthenware. He says a lot of it had to do with wanting to define a palette more clearly. He says, "I just wanted more punch at times. I wanted to be able to have a pink and put it somewhere, and it was going to be pink when it came out. But I also wanted the clay body, the sense of clay, the materiality of clay, that earth. I didn't know how to get bright colors and also have a clay body that made sense to me visually and tactily out of high temperatures. I began to try to figure out ways of making low temperature clay look interesting, or clay-like, or have some heart. I fire everything in an electric kiln, and electric kilns just don't have much soul. They aren't around for thousands of years, and they don't get named, and they're really kind of uninteresting things, and they're not very fun to fire, meaning it's not a community adventure. But I like the results a lot, so I keep picking away at that." Mackenzie decided to retire, and after a national search, Pharis got the first full-time permanent job. Commuting from Houston was no longer a reasonable possibility. He rented a house in River Falls for a year, only about 40 minutes away from the university, before finding land on which to build his own house in nearby Roberts, Wisconsin. He rented the Yucatan house for a year to a woman who then moved away. In the meantime, Linda Sikora had arrived at the university as a graduate student. She did a summer residency at the Archie Bray Foundation, where another resident was Matt Metz. And the rest, as they say, is history. Metz was already a production potter. When he joined her in Minnesota, he needed a place to work, so they rented the Pharis farm. It was a perfect setup with a dough mixer and a kiln ready to go. In December of her third year of graduate school, with her coursework finished, she was able to be there full-time working on her thesis show. They subsequently bought the farm on a contract for deed. The price, again, was modest, and they didn't need a wad of cash to pull it off. Pharis frequently visited Sikora in Metz in those first years. He says it was painful to have departed, but it was sweet that it was, again, a studio. Sikora says that many of her influences when she was in graduate school blurred together, but noticeably she was working on constructed form and color. She also embraced English porcelain, which she had grown up with. And then, presto, she was out at the farm and was using a wood kiln. The forms started to simplify a lot. I came through school when everyone was cutting and pasting, she says. I became interested in how to throw well, how to throw a good round pot. But of course, we all have temperaments, and I think I had a certain need for engagement, which meant that the energy that was going into constructing previously now started to show up in the surface. That's when pattern began to come in. So instead of the forms being more articulated, the form became more simplified, and the surface became more articulated. Speaking of Pharis as a teacher, but in a way that reflects also on the farm, Sikora says, Mark really showed us the lay of the land. He showed us a lot, so our eyes were opened. Neither Sikora nor Metz was very experienced at wood firing, but she says Mark came out and showed us how to use the kiln, and we just kind of went for it. We were using the warmth, and there was wood ash landing on the work and melting. Then we switched to oil, and so there's a lot less ash falling on the work. And with the oil, we're taking it up to temperature, and it's melting out. So the effect is you can see some ash on some of the pieces, but you can't see so much. It's more about the quality of the color, and it's in the glazes. Metz, too, speaks highly of the kiln. He had been using a gas salt kiln, but when he moved to Mark, he says, quote, when we moved to Mark's place, and that was the kiln that was there. And over the years, I just developed the work around it and got to the point of really liking the combination of stiff drawings with warmth, less figure ground and less hard. And the reference to old pots, too, obviously. When Linda and I are doing very complex decorative stuff, we like the warmth of some wood, but to strictly wood fire would cover up the drawings. So this is a nice combination. And there was the pragmatic cost issue of making a living. He says, when we were in Minnesota, the kiln was very cheap to fire because fuel oil wasn't very much at the time, and the wood that we were using to fire, they'd throw away from manufacturing lumber and stuff. We could get 8 or 10 kilns of wood for $50. That's not true anymore. Metz recalls, we were there 13 or 14 years, and Linda, within maybe 5 or 6 years, started doing some teaching here and there and took a job in Colorado. And all the time, we kept the place in Minnesota. And that was why their sort of residency program started. The young people that they invited came to cat sit. When Sikora and Metz moved to Yucatan, there was a feral cat who had kittens. They ended up with 9 cats. They had them neutered. The cats lived outdoors and but still they became semi-domesticated, sleeping in an insulated cat box near the electric kiln room at the end of the barn studio and needing to be fed. So the first cat sitter was Karen Newgard in 1996. As a core student at Penland, she had assisted Sikora and Metz in a workshop. A curious coincidence is that Newgard had begun carving when she was in school at Louisiana State University. She knew nothing of Metz's work until she assisted them at Penland. She says, I was carving, covering the whole thing in black, carving an image so it looked like a photo negative. At Penland, I switched to porcelain because it was giving me more clarity of image. Newgard says I could use their studio, I could use their wood kiln, stay in the house. I had never fired a kiln like that before, but they told me what the gig was, and I had fired enough kilns at Penland that I sort of could handle it. I showed up on their doorstep, and there was not much in my pocket, so I wasn't taking too many trips. And it was winter in Minnesota. And the sun goes down at 3:30 in the winter. But it was my personal test, she says, to see if I could be a studio potter, because I'd always been in the classroom situation, or at Penland, you were in a group situation, and you always had someone to talk to. So it was just me, my dog, and my cat, and their 9 cats. The solitude was unfamiliar to her, but she learned to love it. While she was there, she applied to the Baltimore ACC show. It was the first show she ever did, and she recalls, Matt let me borrow his booth. I spent the winter making all these pots. It gave me time to figure out what I could make in a month, let's say. So when I went to Baltimore to do wholesale, I had an idea of a dollar amount per order, how much I could produce, and when I could promise it. I'm fresh out of the gate. I'd only been making things to experiment, never for production necessarily. So I went to the show, and according to my little chart that I made, I took orders for the first 4 hours of that show, and then I had sold out my time for the next 16 months. Probably underpriced. Her Minnesota good luck continued as she went from Baltimore to the New Orleans Jazz Fest and won Best in Show. But there was also bad luck in that while she was house sitting, her own house burned down and she lost everything, all her records, everything. But she has long since recovered, and she now lives and works in Asheville. To keep this time-consuming work more affordable, she simplified some of her forms, and she got faster at carving, even though it continues to be intricate. The second resident, in 1997, was an old friend of Matt's from his days as tech at the University of Michigan Ceramic Studio. Nancy Blum started out in ceramics. Well, actually, she started out in social work, but her art was first ceramics. But she now makes drawings and paintings and public art from her studio in Brooklyn. In fact, if you happen to ride on the Green Line train between Minneapolis and St. Paul here, you can see her public artworks on the platform at the University of Minnesota and the Fairview station. And then here you're seeing her brand new piece, which just opened a couple of months ago at 28th Street on the 6th line in New York City. Here you see some of her earlier ceramic work that they showed together. Blum describes herself as having been nomadic at the time that she worked at the farm, having finished graduate school at Cranbrook and residencies at the Archie Bray Foundation and the Banff Center for Arts. She shared the barn studio with Matt and was trying to see if she could make her living from Judaica. Her ceramic works, you will notice, share both a drawn and carved qualities with Metz's work, although their style and subject matter is quite different. Her relief is heavier. She also made Netske-like small objects, and also what she called beads. And in the show at Concordia, you'll see one of her chains of large beads in the exhibition. They have a ritual kind of quality that, like counting beads, that possibly comes from her interest in Buddhism. Another visitor to the Yucatan farm was Andy Brayman, now proprietor of the Matter Factory in Kansas City. If you ask him about his memories of Minnesota, here's what you get. But other things there also interested him, as they had Pharis, such as local structures. Here's a pretty horrible picture, but I think you can make out these bins of ears of corn, and also local surfaces that he would come across. Brayman had crossed paths with Sikora at Alfred, being a student when she was hired to teach there. I didn't get a chance to work with Linda that much, he says. It was one of my regrets at the time. I have since been able to have conversations, and I know how she talks about her work, and I have great respect for her. She's smart as a tack, and yet she's making pots. That's interesting. He goes on, so I graduated and I didn't want to teach. I wanted to keep working in the studio. Matt and Linda were nice enough to say, okay, you can come to our place in Minnesota. I didn't really have plans on being a rural potter. That wasn't what I imagined in my future. But it was kind of neat to be able to make believe for 6 or 8 months or whatever to see what that would be like. So I got to work next to Matt Metz, who was just a force of nature in terms of his work ethic. He says, Matt is definitely a potter's potter. The guy is amazing with a totally Midwestern reserve, too. He wouldn't be comfortable if he heard me probably talking about how great he is, but it was really great to be there. And it was sort of like the shadow of Linda was there. Her pots were there, and I was in her studio. My official title, like the others, was cat sitter. Matt was doing shows at the time, like Philadelphia show, and so I went with him and saw what that was like. So it was sort of like a semester. Matt was there for the fall semester, and then he went to Alfred to join Linda, and I was there for the spring. And I made terrible work. The stuff I made while I was there was really bad. Not that it matters, it's not uncommon. I was trying to make the best work I could make. It wasn't bad like I was ripping somebody off, like making Matt's work. It was just like all that pressure and structure of school is removed, and I had to figure out how to work. I never really felt like I've repaid them for that. Pharis recalls that Brayman was one of the cat sitters who had most trouble with the isolation of the place. Brayman noted, "It's Houston, Minnesota. It's really the sticks." And it was 1999 and there was internet and stuff, but there wasn't this community that you could plug into. It was dial-up connection. Sanam Emami had taken ceramics as a side interest in college, not thinking it would be her life's work, although now she is a professor at Colorado State University. But after a couple of years of trying different careers, she came back to clay and needed to get up to speed. As I was traveling across the country, I visited with some Minnesota potters, Mark Pharis, Randy Johnston. Mark said, if I had a daughter and she wanted to study studio pottery, I would tell her to go and work with Linda. That was the summer before Linda got the job at Boulder. I met Linda and Matt, and they were very wonderful, so I decided to go to Boulder and do a one-year post-bac program with Linda. Then she assumed that she would go to graduate school. I put together an application, and I applied, and I didn't get in anywhere, which is something I always tell my students, you have to persevere. I didn't know what I was going to do, and Linda said, do you want to come and live at the farm, take care of the cats, and use the studio? So I spent 1 year. She goes on, I got to be a little part of that lineage. She really got some wonderful people to live out there. That year was great for me because I got to know Matt. He stayed for 2 or 3 months and worked before he went to join Linda. In the mornings, Matt would get up, have breakfast, and would go to work. And he would work 12 hours a day. I had never seen that or experienced it, and I think that was really important for me. And also, he was so generous with his ideas. Matt is an articulate maker. Although he's not an academic, when you talk to him, he's so sharp, so smart. We'd sit around for hours and talk about pots. What does it mean to make pots? Why are we making them? Who are they for? Who is the audience? It wasn't in the context of a critique, an academic situation. It's how we were living out there. I think the other part of the education was just watching him work. In the evening, he would tell me how his day had gone, and he would tell me things he'd been thinking about. I felt like it was a window into an artist's studio practice that was very different from anything I'd had up to that point. It was a great way for me to ask him about things. And the thing about Matt that's so wonderful is that he wanted to know my thoughts. So it was this exchange. He became a mentor for me in a different kind of way than I had ever had up to that point. And I have to say, the thing I love about Matt and identify with, he's so critical of his own work, and I'm the same way. He would unload a kiln. I remember one kiln in particular where he just started breaking all the pieces. For him, there was something he really needed to happen that hadn't happened. I couldn't see it. I just saw these beautiful objects. But that level of rigor in studio practice and also the rigor in what you put out into the world, I think Matt was such a great role model for me. He isn't a potter who spends a small amount of time on his work. He spends a lot of time on each object. That was a great year. The only hard part was when Matt left, and I was there on my own in the middle of nowhere. The good thing about being out there was that it gave me time to make a lot of work. In school or in most situations, I had been working, had been very public, so I felt like I didn't really learn how to take risks or make work that was not resolved. At the farm, I made a lot of work that I didn't want anyone to see. I could just spend hours working on a question. It gave me permission to take risks and to experiment. Nobody was there to ask me why I did something. I could just try it. That summer, after that experience, Emami got a summer residency at the Bray, and then soon thereafter, she got a full 2-year residency. She says, I think at that point I was so ready for dialogue and exchange. I felt that I had learned to have a work ethic by working with Matt and by living by myself. Autumn Sipala's experience was slightly more limited and also different because she was not there alone. In Maine one summer, she had met Rob Sutherland, and they became good friends. He was going to house sit for Metz and Sikora the following winter. He no longer works in clay, and he did not respond to repeated invitations from me and other people to participate in this show. But sometimes you don't get your choice. We have him in the show anyway because Linda owned a piece of his work, so it's there. And here is this page from American Ceramics because I don't have any of his slides or other images. Anyway, he invited Sipala to come along with him to work at the farm because at that point, she was at the point where she wanted to try to make her own things. It was very easy, she says. I brought my clothes, plopped in there, and that winter and spring, I had my first opportunity to make my own work. I saved up money and just made pots. From that point, I started making work and showing and selling it, starting in Minnesota. She moved back to Maine, where she still lives and works, and Sutherland moved on to Philadelphia and was one of the artists that was involved in restoring the Brewery Town neighborhood. And as I understand it, he got involved in real estate, but I have no idea what the story is now. Chuck Eidlet, who is now the manager of the clay business at the Archie Bray Foundation, had taught for 7 years at Penn State and had come to Minnesota for a job at St. Cloud State University. But he hit one of those walls where he knew something needed to change in his work. He left the university and he and his wife spent a year living at the farm. They also just wanted to try living in that kind of isolation. He was working with Maiolica and firing electric, although he did put a few pieces in the wood and oil kiln when Metz would periodically return to work in the studio and fire. Eidlet made major changes in his approach to imagery, moving from low fire to mid fire and from brushes to underglazed pencil while he was there. And he also began teaching at Winona State University, and he stayed on in that job after leaving the farm. He says it was a blast to be there, and that one of the treats was that he and his wife constructed a luge track from the house down to the barn where the studio was so that they could just zip down there. He says he learned about travel coffee mugs with lids to get a cup of coffee down to the studio without wearing it. It was an unusual commute. What sticks with him from the Yucatan experience is his need for isolation and his need for change at the same time. Isolation is part of this story. You can look at an image like this and feel that the hills embrace the valley, but also that they shut it off from the rest of the world. In 2006, Sikora and Metz sold the Yucatan farm and moved full-time to Alfred Station, New York. They were not able to find a potter buyer, probably, they think, because the farm was too far from other major urban centers for most people. The buyer was someone from Rochester who worked for the Division of Natural Resources and was interested in prairie restoration, but that didn't really go anywhere either. This guy subsequently sold it also to someone from the family who had owned it before Pharis. So the pottery years of the farm were just one arc in what turned out to be a circle. While the farm was a valuable experience for everyone, it was not without complications. Pharis says that for him, the only pressures were financial. He could work largely uninfluenced except by his previous experiences. Pots, he says, are an isolated activity, like writing. On the other hand, he says, there wasn't a decent loaf of bread within 35 miles. So they learned to make their own. When he taught at Alfred one summer session, he met Rob Forbes, who was then teaching at what's now the University of the Arts, and was living in an Italian neighborhood of Philadelphia. Forbes used to send him care packages with cheese and olives and things like that you couldn't get in Yucatan. Pharis thinks on reflection that he had a kind of love-hate relationship with the place, but he says, it gave me myself. And it seems touching then that a trace of him remains there in his name on the farm's access road. That's it.